Bugungi darsimizda Cambridge 12, test 7, section 4 analizini ko'rib chiqamiz. Keling, birinchi navbatda savollarni ko'rib chiqamiz, o'qib chiqamiz. Section 4, questions 31 to 40. Instructions, one word only. The effects of environmental change on birds, ya'ni atrof-muhitdagi o'zgarishlarni qushlarda ta'siri ko'rib chiqamiz. Mercury, research on effects of mercury, implications for humans. O'zing ko'rganingda bu qismda turli xil sub headline bergan ekan. Menimcha sub headline bilan ismi bilmayman ham. Ism muhim emas. Faqatgina konsepsiyani tushunishliging kerak, nima uchun kerak bularni bilishimiz va ularga e'tibor berishimiz. Chunki Mercuryda bitta to'xtashadi. Research on effects on mercury on birds da bitta to'xtashadi. E plus implicationda ozgina to'xtash 3-4 sekund to'xtashlab bo'ladi. O'sha orqali sizlar o'zingni kalibratsiya qilib ishlang mumkin. Masalan, 31 o'tkazib oldingizmi? 32 ni hozir men qanaqa qilib toparkanman deb o'tirmaysizda. Research of effects bo'ladi, clear variant dramas bo'ladi. Keladi, voy, keldi 32 javobimiz kelayotgan ekan deb topishlik mumkin bo'ladi. Keyin endi o'qiymiz. Mercury highly toxic, released into atmosphere from coal. In water it may consumed by fish. It also recently found to affect birds which feed on. Demak, bu oxirgi kunlarda topilgan ekan. Effekt qilar ekan birdlarni, ya'ni qushlarni effekt qilar ekan, qaysiki nimanidir yeydigan. Demak, javob fish bo'lmaydi. Ya'ni nimalarnidir yeydigan qushlarni effekt qilishi, qushlarga ta'sir o'tkazishi topilgan ekan. Demak, bu qanaqadir qushlar yeyishi mumkin bo'lgan nima? Qushlar nima yeyishi mumkin? Bu yerda fishni aytib qo'yishibdi. Qushlar qanaqa hayvonlar bu endi? Frogs. Qisqasi shunaqa qisqasi javob bu qismda qanaqadir hayvon bo'ladi. O'zing ko'rasizlar. Clear variant dramas is investigates the effects of birds or mental processes of memory. Demak, bu qismda Mercuryni qushlarning nimasidir yoki mental process, ya'ni miyasi mental ishlashishi, for example, memorysini demak, qushlarning qanaqadir miyasiga aloqador boshqa narsada qanaqadir qushlarning hayotiga aloqador nimadir bo'ladi bu qismda. Effects on bird song usually learn from a bird something, someone. Demak, bu qismda qushlarning kuylashidagi effektlar bu kimdandir o'rganilar ekan. Birds nima bo'lishi mumkin? Kimdan o'rganish mumkin? Qushlar kuylashi. Mother, father, brother, sister, uncle, grandmother, shunaqa narsalar bo'ladi bu qismda. Friend, peers, finding song learned by birds exposed to mercury are less. Bu adjective bo'ladi. Demak, bu qismda mercurydan zararlangan qushlarning anolari nima edi? Song, ya'ni kuylari are less beautiful, are less interesting. Shunaqa narsalar bo'ladi menimcha. It may have negative effect on birds something. Bu o'shani xuddi shu fakt qushlarning nimasigadir yomon effektga sabab bo'ladi. Lab based studies allow more for experimenter. Demak, bu qismda lab based studylar, o'sha laboratoriyada o'tkazilgan studylar eksperiment qilayotgan odamga nimadir beradi, ko'proq nimadir berar ekan. Ko'ramiz. Imkoniyat berar ekan. Implications for humans. Migrating birds such as containing mercury may be eaten by humans. Demak, qismda migratsiya qiladigan qushlar shu jumladan degan yana nimalar qanaqa qush turi containing mercury may be eaten by humans. O'shani mercuryni o'z ichiga olar ekan va ular odam tomonidan yeyilishi mumkin ekan. Demak, bu qismda qush turi. Bilmayman qanaqa qush turlarini bilasiz mana. Nima bo'lishi mumkin? Yana stork masalan turni, yana nima qanaqa qush turlarini bilsanglar, o'sha yerda yozasizlar. Chumchuq, burgut, bir narsalar, o'sha narsalarni yozasizlar. Mercury also causes problems in learning something. Demak, odamlarda mercury nimanidir o'rganishda problemalar sabab bo'lgan ekan. Mercury in a mother's body from may affect the unborn child. Demak, onani tanasidagi mercury nimadir orqali hali tug'ilmagan bolani effekt qilishi mumkin, tug'ilmagan bolaga ta'sir o'tkazishi mumkin. Nima bo'lishi mumkin? Bu ona tasavvur qiling, bolasi tug'ilmagan aniq. Nimadan o'tadi? Sutdan o'tmaydi, chunki tug'ilmagan. Qondan o'tishi ehtimoli bor, suvdan o'tishi ehtimoli bor yoki oksigen. Nafasdan olish ehtimoli bor. New regulations for mercury emission will affect everyone's energy something. Demak, mercury emission haqidagi yangi regulation, qonun qoidalar hammaning energiya bo'yicha nimasigadir ta'sir qiladi. Bilmayman nima bo'lishini. Ko'ramiz, topamiz. Keling endi eshitishni boshlaymiz. Chunki o'zi 5 minutdan beri valdirab o'tiramiz, gapirib o'tiramiz. Faqatgina vaqt ketkazib. Wow, internet ishlamayapti. Internet is not working.
are affected by environmental change. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40.
o'qib olinglar.
Changes in our environment.
31 to 40.
Let's go.
Okay, so we've been looking at how man-made changes in our environment can affect wildlife. Now, I'll discuss a particular example. Let's take a look at mercury. Mercury's one of the 120 or so elements that make up all matter, and it has the symbol Hg. It's a shiny, silvery substance. You may have seen it in old-fashioned thermometers, but it's not used much for domestic purposes now because it's highly toxic. But the problem is that the amount of mercury in the environment's increasing. The main reason for this is the power plants used to produce electricity. The main source of energy that most of them use is still coal, and when it's burned, it releases mercury into the atmosphere. Some of this gets deposited into lakes and rivers, and if it's ingested by a fish, it's not excreted. It stays in the fish's body, and it enters the food chain. So, it's been known for some time that birds which eat fish may be affected. But what wasn't known until quite recently is that those that eat insects can also be affected.
O'zing ko'rganingizdek ko'p vaqtda ko'p berganlardik. Fish, merkuridan zaharlangan fish yegan birdlar affect qilinadi, lekin insektlarni ham yeganlar ham ta'sirlanar ekan. Insects degani hasharotlar degani. Demak, feed on insects, demak tanasiga merkuriy kirib qolgan hasharotlarni ham yegan birdlar zararlanar ekan. So it has been known for some time that birds which eat fish may be affected, but what wasn't known until quite recently is that those that eat insects can also be affected. Job insects bo'ladi.
So, a woman called Claire Varian Ramos is doing some research on how this is affecting birds. And rather than looking at how many birds are actually killed by mercury poisoning, she's looking for more subtle sub-effects. And these may be to do with the behavior of the birds, or with the effect of mercury on the way their brain works. So, whether it leads to problems with memory, for example.
O'z ko'rgingizda nechta qanaqa turdagi qushlar zararlanganligini emas, subtle changeslarga qaraymiz. Masalan, behavior dedi. Behavior. Ya'ni поведениясida o'zgarishlar yoki просто qanaqa miyasining ishlashi bo'yicha o'zgarishlar, masalan, bunga memoryga ta'sir qiladi. There may be to do with the behavior of the birds or with the effects of mercury on the way their brain works, whether it leads to problem with memory, for example. The javob qisqasi behavior bo'ladi. Behavior.
And she's particularly focusing on the effects of mercury on bird song. Now, the process of song learning happens at a particular stage in the bird's development. And what you may not know is that a young bird seems to acquire this skill by listening to the songs produced by its father, rather than by any other bird.
O'zing ko'rganingda otasidan bird father dedi. Father otasidan o'rganar ekan kuylashni birdlar, bu birdlar bo'ldi. O'qib olishimiz kerak endi. Now, the process of song learning happens at a particular stage in bird's development. That what you may not know is that young bird seems to acquire the skill by listening to the songs produced by its father, rather than by any other bird.
And Varian Ramos has already found in her research that if young male birds are exposed to mercury, if they eat food contaminated with mercury, then the songs they produce aren't as complex as those produced by other birds.
Aren't as complex as strukturasini ishlatdi. As complex as other complex bo'ladi javob. They aren't as complex as birds, songs produced by other birds. Javob complex bo'ldi. has found that research that if young male birds are exposed to mercury, they eat food contaminated with mercury. The songs they produce aren't as complex as those produced by other birds. Javob bo'ladi, complex bo'ladi javob hisob.
So, quite low-level exposure to mercury is likely to have an impact on male birds in a natural situation because it can mean that they're less attractive to female birds, and so it can affect their chances of reproduction.
Reproduction bo'ladi javob. Qisqasi, negatively affects their chance of reproduction. Javob reproduction. Damn it, man. Reproduction bo'ldi javob qisqasi. Keyingisiga o'tamiz endi. This may have a negative effect on birds' reproduction later on. Dedim nimada? Hop, impact on male birds on a natural situation because it can mean that there is less attractive to female birds, so it can affect their chance of reproduction. Javob reproduction bo'ladi.
Now, the way she's carrying out this research is worth thinking about. She's using a mixture of studies, using birds kept in laboratories and studies carried out outdoors in the wild. The lab-based studies have the advantage that you don't get all the variables you would in a natural setting. So, the experimenter has a much higher level of control.
Experimenter has a much higher level of control. You make allow more control for the experimenter. Control bo'larkan job. Control. Those lab-based studies have the advantage of you don't get at all the variables you would in a natural setting, so the experiment has a much higher level of control. Control.
And that means they can be more confident about their results in some ways. And of course, they don't have to worry about going out and finding the birds in order to observe them. So, what are the implications here for humans? Well, because many birds are migratory, they may be transporting mercury far from contaminated sites. For example, it's been found that ducks who'd been feeding at a contaminated site were later shot by hunters over 1,000 kilometers away.
Ducks dedi qisqasi, ducklar o'sha yerkanda, keyin 80 kilometrlarda awayda hunterlar bilan yeyilar ekan, hunterlar tomonidan keyin merkuriy odam tanasiga kirib qolar ekan qisqasi. What is this thing? So what are the implications for humans? Because many birds are migratory, they tend to be transporting mercury from all contaminated sites. Has been found that ducks who had been feeding at the contaminated site were later shot by hunters over 1,000 kilometers away and presumably eaten. Job, what are the ducks?
And presumably eaten. But these birds likely had mercury levels high enough to warrant concern for human consumption. In addition, going back to song learning by birds, we saw that this may be affected by mercury contamination. Well, we also know that in humans, mercury causes developmental delays in the acquisition of language.
Developmental delays in acquisition of language dedi qisqasi learning languages bo'ladi, acquisition language bo'ladi qisqasi. Language, not languages. Chunki acquisition of language dedi, learning language bo'ladi. Acquisition of language. Job. We also know that in humans, mercury causes development delays in acquisition of knowledge. Job, knowledge, language bo'ladi qisqasi, acquisition of language. Qisqasi javob 9 language bo'ladi.
And in fact, this process is very similar in the brain regions it involves. And
international qoldi zo'r.
Even the genes that are involved. But mercury contamination has other important implications for humans as well. It's now known that an unborn child can be affected if the food eaten by its mother contains high levels of mercury.
From food. Food bo'larkan javob. Food. Mercury in a mother's body from food may affect an unborn child. It's known that an unborn child can be affected if the food eaten by the mother contains levels of mercury.
And these effects can be quite substantial. In the end, it comes down to whether more value is placed on human economic well-being or environmental well-being. It's true there are new regulations for mercury emissions from power plants, but these will need billions of dollars to implement and increase costs for everyone. Some argue
Increased cost for everyone again will affect everyone's energy cost bo'lar ekan. Energy costs. Increased cost for everyone. It's true that there are new regulations about mercury emissions from power plants, but this will need billions of dollars to implement and increase costs for everyone.
that's too much to pay to protect wildlife. But as we've seen, the issues go beyond that. And I think it's an issue we need to consider very carefully.
Shu bilan bugungi darsimiz o'z oxiriga yetadi. Hamma savollarga javob berishga harakat qildik. O'zing ko'rganingdek, masalan, to'g'ri javoblarni circle qildik, undagi qo'shimcha ma'lumotlarni, kerakli ma'lumotlarni underline qilishga harakat qildik. Agar muammo bo'ladigan bo'lsa, biror narsani tushunmaydigan bo'lsangiz, iltimos faqatgina skriptlarni o'qinglar. Skriptlarni yodlashga emas, prosta so'zlarni, skriptlarda bilmaydigan so'zlarni yodlashga, bilmaydigan strukturalarni o'zingga внедрять qilishga harakat qilishingiz kerak. Agar muammo bo'ladigan bo'lsa, kommentariyada qoldiringlar. Keyingi darsda ko'rishguncha xayr, bye bye.